In 2019, this should never be like a rarity to see a cohesive, dark-skinned Black family.
Why can't Black women in all shades and all forms just be beautiful and it not be up for debate in that way?
We need continuous progress, and we need all the colors of Asian America represented in Hollywood, because that's just who we are.
Today, we're tearing into colorism and media's role in combating it. Joining me is HuffPost Black Voices editor TARYN FINLEY, HuffPost Asian American Affairs reporter KIMMY, and HuffPost senior reporter Ziba Play. TARYN, I want to start with you. How does colorism affect you?
Colorism is this very complex and deep thing, like racism. Those who have these more Eurocentric features are often preferred or often elevated above those with darker skin, those with kinkier hair, those with wider set noses, broader lips. I am kind of like in the middle, right? Like, I'm not a dark-skinned Black woman. I'm also not a light-skinned Black woman. So with that, I understand that I do have certain privileges that a lot of darker skinned Black people don't have. But I also, may get passed up or may be deemed as not as beautiful or not as valuable as someone who has lighter skin than me, especially because, my hair is kinky, my nose is wide, my lips are big, so all of these things kind of play into colorism.
I know for me, it's very interesting because I'm a dark-skinned Black woman. I'm so thankful that for whatever reason I didn't grow up with a complex around that. I love being dark-skinned. I cherish it. I think it's one of the most beautiful things about me. And I think that's what's so insidious about colorism, is that you can feel however you feel about yourself, but how the world views you can chip away at that self-esteem. We have to reinforce the value in dark skin and the beauty in dark skin for younger women, because it takes a lot of fortitude to combat that.
It's also interesting in the Latinx community, because the one thing that ties all Latinos and Latinas in the US together is colonialism. We speak the language of the people that conquered us. Spanish is the thing that connects us. Other than that, we're so vastly different. And when you think about the impacts that colonialism had, this is a proximity to whiteness. They brought their own class system as well. And so that's something that within the Latinx community, there's a deep-rooted denial of that.
I think there's this completely misguided notion that Asians and Asian Americans are, addiction to light-skinned or whiteness is solely about our proximity to white people or whiteness. And I think a lot of that stems from this myth that Asians are basically white. Our obsession with light skin predates all of that, and it predates European colonialism in Asia. A lot of it has to do with status. Back in the day, if you were an upper echelon type person, then you would be in the house and you wouldn't be working out in the fields or anything, and your complexion would not be darker. And so I think even now, a lot of people wear gloves or, bring around an umbrella or something like that to make sure their skin doesn't get darker.
I think it's really interesting that you talk about this Asian perspective of how colorism is so tied to class, because I just find it interesting because it sort of parallels the features of colorism amongst the Black community, because where did colorism come from? It came, when you think back to slavery, you think of the slaves in the house versus the slaves in the field. The slaves in the house were usually lighter skinned. They were usually lighter skinned Black folk were usually the ones who were able to own land and build wealth. There's a through line of lighter skin equates somehow a higher class,
Status,
elite status. Darker skin is somehow uneducated, lower class. And the fact that you see that throughout all of these communities is really interesting to me.
What about us taking an adventure east?
Like Queens?
I mean, I'll preface this by saying that Crazy Rich Asians, at the end of the day, was a huge moment because it was so filled with not only Asians, but it was very diverse kind of personalities, and it kind of let Asian people be Asians in their own right. But Because Crazy Rich Asians took place in Singapore, I think that there was a huge absence of Southeast Asian representation. In Singapore, we know that Malays and Indians are targeted by discrimination. They do face a lot of exploitation there. But I also feel that if we put all our expectations of Asian representation on this one movie, then Hollywood would have failed. You know, you don't just give a group one movie and you're supposed to be happy with it. You know, we need continuous progress, and we need all the colors of Asian America represented in Hollywood, because that's just who we are. Hopefully we learn, you know, the lessons from Crazy Rich Asians, and I critique it because I love it, but there just needs to be more out there.
When you talk about Southeast Asian representation, like there's a $1 billion industry of, you know, Bollywood, where there are movies being made that are supposed to be representative of that group, and even within that industry you see that lighter skinned people are usually the most famous. They're the movie stars. We focus on America and American representation in movies, but like once again, it's a global thing. I'm from Ghana, and the most famous actress in Ghana is Nadia Boiri, who is a very light-skinned woman, and if you go to Ghana, most Ghanaians are my complexion. And it's just interesting that you see this not only in representation in Hollywood here, but in all forms of media all over the world.
Black China was just in Nigeria selling a skin bleaching
Fair and
cream
lovely, yeah, and
called White Nicious.
Yeah,
Literally White Nicious.
And people will buy it. And whenever I'm in Ghana, you will see billboards selling Fair and Lovely, and that's a product that is sold all over the world. It's sold in Jamaica, it's sold in the Caribbean, like it's sold everywhere. These things are so ubiquitous, and what is being done to actually combat that?
Right.
There are so many of these, you know, famous or power players in not only just like hip hop, but just throughout industries, period, who when a dark-skinned woman, when they are complimenting a dark-skinned woman, a lot of times I feel like it's very fetishy, and they'll like they'll compliment her specifically on her skin that is in a very creepy and it feels like a gross way.
Same conversation happened around Lupita Nyong'o, who
Yes.
is clearly one of the most beautiful people on the planet, but I've seen comments about like, oh, well, you guys are only saying that because she's dark. It's like when people do recognize her beauty, it's fetishizing it. It's like, oh, her skin is like chocolate. How many times have I been walking down the street and someone has called chocolate down the street at me? And it's like, we don't know how to talk about Black beauty without these caveats, without these debates. It's like, why can't Black women in all shades and all forms just be beautiful and it not be up for debate in that way?
I think right now the onus is on Hollywood to start picking up more, you know, stories that show a much more diverse array of color, you know, because right now it really isn't very reflective of what everyone looks like.
And make it make sense. There are so many times, like honestly, because a lot of times the casting decisions, especially when we're casting like around families, specifically I'm thinking about Black families, and you have like a dark-skinned dad and then like a brown-skinned mom, and then the kids are light, and then like it's just really wild. I do think that there are some power players like Jordan Peele, some power players who are like in Hollywood making these intentional decisions, but like in 2019, this should never be like a rarity to see a cohesive Black family, dark-skinned Black family. There needs to be a widespread effect.
Yeah. There's a show that's out on Netflix called Made in Mexico. That's like a reality TV show around 20-somethings that sets out to try to change the vision of what people think of Mexicans. That was kind of their whole mission. And everyone is like a super, super light-skinned person. It's like a person that looks like me. And that, it's a little bit alarming because a lot of film that's coming out of Latin America, film and TV, notorious for just having super light-skinned actors. But with this having the intention of coming out and changing the perception of Mexico with people that are just very, very white looking, I mean, that's kind of, it shows the power that these kinds of things potentially might have, right? Because if they're setting out to do that, like what kind of success could they reach?
And they still mess up. Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that, because I'm thinking of as like the opposite of that, like a movie like Roma with an actress who is indigenous and like was recently on the cover of of Vogue and looked amazing, and it was like such an amazing moment because how often do you see a Mexican actress who has an indigenous face being like propped up in this way? So it's interesting the parallels of like people are trying to change things, and then it's like one step forward, two steps back, kind of.
Recently, actually, Blackish just tried to cover the issue of colorism, and they're getting a lot of celebration because they covered really just how complex the issue is.
No one in this family is as dark as me. That's the problem.
That's not a problem. The fact that you're different is a good thing.
Mm-hmm. If it's so good, then why are you all so scared to talk about it?
My heart went out for little Diane because it's like, the fact that her entire family was that oblivious to how colorism was affecting her, I think that echoes what we were talking about as far as how it plays out in our communities. If the family, a lot of times families are hesitant. They don't want to talk about this, not only because they don't see it as an issue, but also because they may have to confront some biases that they have themselves.
And it's interesting because in that episode, the lighter skinned members of the family talk about how they feel discriminated against themselves, which is like something that we don't talk about in this colorism conversation, at least within the Black community. There's always a sense of like, okay, well, like, oh, you feel bad for being dark skinned, but like I was bullied by dark skinned people for being light. I think when we have these conversations, whatever anyone is saying is just coming from a place of pain. It's saying, I'm hurt.
I think a lot of times with knowledge there comes sometimes comes, you know, privilege. And I think, you know, I had the privilege of going to college and kind of learning about a lot of these things. So we have to kind of understand that especially a lot of these groups of color are just trying to make it in America, and there wasn't that education there before. But are these conversations that we have to have that are really painful and awkward? Yes, they are necessary in order to also move forward.
Intra-community conversations are so important for not only recognizing that pain and that hurt and where it comes from, but also educating in a way that, you know, allows grace, because there are oftentimes, not even oftentimes, like marginalized people, we do not get grace when it comes to like being wrong and messing up and working through these things.
I mean, I think accountability is huge, and recognizing how much power, at least within the Latinx community, we are such a big group. There's so much money and like spending power behind us that we can change things. Like we just created the term Latinx because we realized that our words were gendered, and like we have the power to do that. Thank you guys so much for chatting.